Good day, sir, and good day, classmates. We are the discussants for this chapter, the ethics, values, and spiritually in leading and managing schools. The ethical behavior of school leader. So, if Beck and Murphy are right, the majority of school officials have thrown into the chaos of leadership without much formal training for the moral dilemmas they would encounter. So, according to William Greenfield, 1985, he argues that informal socialization is a strong conservative force in the development of school leaders, pushing them to uphold the status quo. But how do school leaders view ethical issues? Few systematic studies have been done, so the question can be answered only very tentatively. To begin with, school leaders often see their job in moral terms. Arthur Blumberg and William Greenfield found that the exceptional principles they studied operated with the unwritten law of the principalship: thou shalt be an advocate for children. In other study, Greenfield found that one elementary principle's influence was based on her appeal to a common moral vision. The ideal of service to children in desperate need is the moral standard against which daily practices are judged. Teachers and principals alike are held to this standard by one another. Nobody is allowed off the hook. Making ethical decisions. Ethical beliefs belong to the category of normative statements, that is, they claim to tell us how we should behave. Greenfield points out that not all normative statements are ethical. So to say that tulip bulbs should be planted in fall is normative, but to little ethical consequences, ethical issues arise when our behavior affects other people. So Rustworth Kither notes that such issues occupy the domain between freedom and law. That is, there are certain decisions we can make without restraint based purely on our own preferences. Other decisions are regulated by society through a system of law. Choosing between roast turkey and a prime rib is a matter of freedom. So leaving the restaurant without pay is not. So ethical questions arise when people believe a certain behavior is highly desirable, but the law is silent. For example, no law requires to us notify a neighbor that he has left his headlights on, but most people would agree that this is something that we should do. Similarly, an administrator may be able to resolve a problem by lying or blaming an innocent party, but people would agree that this is not desirable behavior. So Kidder cites Lord Moulton's comment that the ethics is obedience to the enforceable. Ambiguity and uncertainty. So, ethical issues are inherently debatable. The absence of formal law forces us to consult beliefs, which are seldom anonymous. So, even where there is consensus, for example, that lying is wrong, the beliefs are stated so abstractly that we still have to determine how or if they apply to a particular situation. It is wrong to lie in order to spare someone's feelings. So that is this ambiguity means that before we can do the right thing, we have to determine the right thing first. So this may be especially difficult for the school leaders who work in a complex public arena where an increasingly diverse society generates conflicting moral standards. So Greenfield says it often it is not clear what is right or wrong, or one ought to do, or which perspective is right in moral terms, or it may be clear what one ought to do in moral terms, but circumstances may not permit that course of action. This sort of uncertainty constitute an ethical dilemma. A decision must be made. There are at least two possible choices, each of which will affect other people for better or for worse. And each choice can be plausibly supported by citing various moral principles. So Kidder argues that a true dilemma forces us to choose between two competing goods or between the lesser or two evils. If we hesitate over a choice between right and wrong, we are facing a moral temptation, not an ethical dilemma. Thus, the thought of lying to cover up a mistake constitutes a temptation. The thought of lying to evade a harmful constitutional regulation is a dilemma. So we have the ethical code under the making ethical decision. When ethical questions arise at work, many people instinctively look for something set of rules to follow. Professions such as law and medicine typically provide guidelines in a form of ethical codes. So J.B. Macmillan says that a professional code has several essential characteristics. So first, it is formulated and enforced by autonomous practitioners. Second, it goes beyond the general moral code of society to articulate the special responsibilities of those who belong to the profession. And the third is, it provides a mechanism for clients or members of the public to seek redress when the code has been violated, with meaningful sanctions for violators. So, some school administrators formulated a code in the 1970s as a cooperative effort of the National Association of Secondary School Principals. The American Association of School Administrators and several other administrators association like Arthur Smith and colleagues. According to this code, the school administrators shall make the well-being of students to fundamental value in a decision-making and action. Second, fulfills professional responsibilities with honesty and integrity. Third, supports the principle of due process and protects the civil and human rights of all individuals. Fourth, obey local, state, and national laws and does not knowingly join or support organizations that advocate directly or indirectly the overthrow of the government. Fifth is implements the governing board of education's policies and administrative rules and regulations. Sixth is pursues appropriate measures to correct the laws, policies, and regulations that are not consistent with sound educational goals. Seventh is avoids using professions for personal gain through political, social, religious, economic, or other influence. 8. Accepts academic degrees or professional certification only from duly accredited institution. 9. Maintains the standards and seeks to improve the effectiveness of the profession through research and continuing professional development, honor, and contracts until fulfillment or release. So in addition, despite the claim, this code has provisions for enforcement but is seldom invoked, nor it is easy to tell when a violation has occurred. The well-being of students and sound educational goals. The broad abstractions and could mean almost anything. So, ethical reasoning. So, no matter how thoughtful and comprehensive the ethical code, it will never eliminate the need of deliberate on moral issues. A code provides a guideline, a reminder of core principles. Each practitioner must examine the case and hand to determine how the principles apply. Moreover, the reliance on a code may not fulfill a leader's ethical responsibility. So according to Barry Ball and Martha McCarthy, dispute the common assumption that behavior can be separated into distinct zones of ethical and unethical. In this view, once a person has determined which behaviors are impermissible, everything else is a matter of personal and professional discretion. In reality, Bull and McCarthy argue that ethical principles touch almost everything administrators do. Thus, professionals must be capable of skillful ethical decision making. Confronted with a decision, they must be able to recognize its ethical dimensions and determine their responsibility. So, given the painful choices that are often involved, how though they choose what is fair, ethical, and wise, or more modesty, how do they make a choice that will permit an undisturbed night of sleep? So, under the ethical reasoning, we have the moral intuition. So, one school of thought says that moral reasoning is not a matter of deep abstract thinking, but simply the willingness to respect the moral impulses that we all have. So scholars such as James Q. Wilson and Robert Solomon argue that humans by nature have an intuitive moral understanding, and Solomon says justice is to be found. It is to be found anywhere. So in us, in our sense that there are wrongs in the world to be righted. You don't need an all-embracing sense of justice to recognize the presence of injustice. Often right in front of your nose. So justice is not an ideal state or theory, but a matter of personal sensibility, a set of emotions, what engage is with the world and make us care. As reason alone with all of these brilliant arguments cannot. So we have also the facts of the case. So ethical decisions are not made in a vacuum. Like legal decisions, they involve particular people in particular circumstances. So changes the circumstances and the decisions may change even though our guiding beliefs remain the same. So thus, faced with an apparently ineffective teacher, a principal must first ask some basic questions about the case. So what is the evidence of ineffectiveness? Has the teacher tried to improve his performance? In what ways are students being put at risk? It is teachers demonstrably less effective than colleagues? Or how long has the teacher been with the district? So, what will be the financial and psychological cost of dimensioning the teachers? What impact would the dismissal have on the morale of the other teachers? Or what will happen to the dismissed teachers? The answers to help questions will strongly influence by decisions simply because they help shape our view of what it is stake ethically. So in moral reasoning, Strike and colleagues note that even with sensitivity on our moral intuition and a clear knowledge of the past, we may be left in doubt because basic beliefs are in conflict. The case of the ineffective teacher may lead to us a brutal conclusion. So we can impair the education of a large number of students to ruin a teacher's life to evils. How do we choose the lesser? So in moral reasoning, we have the weighing of the scales of justice. So one of the best known frameworks of moral reasoning is Lawrence Kohlberg's. Building on the work of Jean Piaget, Kohlberg saw moral reasoning as a developmental progression from a moral egocentric thinking to abstract principled thinking. So, at one end of the young child, defining right by immediate personal consequences. At the other end, it is the thoughtful adult reasoning from universal principles with full awareness of obligations to the others. It is according to Don Scruther. In moral principles, the Kohlberg system is process-oriented, seemingly more concerned with the quality of reasoning than the dimension reached. In real life, however, we are more likely to be preoccupied by the particular standards that allow us to tell right from wrong. Some standards also, of course, are the same ones we are told to follow in childhood. So always tell the truth, share with others, keep your word, be fair, and do unto others as what would have them do unto you. So other principles are more abstract. Strike and colleagues list several that are likely to be important, for school leaders. First, we have the intellectual liberty. So people have the right to hold and freely express their views. We have the personal liberty. Personal liberty means people have the right to conduct their lives as they see fit, except as their behavior infringe on the rights of others. We have the equality. Each person should be treated the same, or at least be provided equal opportunities. We have the due process. Means people is apparently violation of rules and laws should be given a fair chance to defend themselves before any penalty is appealed. And last, we have the democracy. So it means members of a community should have an equal opportunity to participate and have an influence in making decisions that will affect them. So most of these principles are rooted in the American democratic tradition, and they have an inherent rightness to anyone raised in the traditions. They are also rather abstract, that leading some critics to look for principles that reflect the rich emotional interaction that characterize classroom life. Last, we have the difficulty of deciding. We have first, seeing what is important in a situation. In seeing what is important in a situation, moral reasoning is just a matter of abstract ideals. It occurs in specific cases that come attached with names and facts. Some of those facts have a legitimate bearing on our decisions. Others are irrelevant. For example, in the case of two competing programs, that thus it matters that most of the migrant students will probably move out of the district by next year. That school is in a region attracting numerous high-tech industries. That the gifted students will probably be able to make satisfactory progress even without the program. So, David Bricker argues that we recognize what is important not through objective reasoning, but through an act of perception that resembles our artistic appreciation. This perception can be developed by having our attention repeatedly called to the moral dimensions of problems. Culture plays a large role giving us an appreciation of certain issues but a blindness to others. For instance, contemporary American culture is oriented toward individual freedom, while Japanese culture tends to emphasize responsibility to the group. Second, we have the reflecting. Strike and colleagues says that moral institutions are never sufficient, if only because they tend to be unexamined. In a school community that brings together so many different viewpoints, leaders have the responsibility of subjecting their institution to conscious reflecting and evaluation. Failing to reflect on how one lives is to refuse to be responsible for one's self. In a fundamental way, it is to refuse to be a person. So reflecting is often thought of as a solitary activity. Radendra Canongo and Manuel Mendo Donca claim that it is only in silence that leaders can hear the inner whisperings that will point them to the right path. These seem to be suggesting that ethical problem solving is very different from the kind of hard-driving, action-oriented posture that leaders need to get through their days. Third, we have the searching for alternatives. So moral dilemmas are agonizing because either choice is painful. Kidder says we can avoid that pain by challenging the assumption that there are only two choices. Some dilemmas are actually trilemmas, offering a third path that avoids the negative consequences of the first two. For example, faced with a parent who objects to a particular homework assignment on religious grounds. Many principals have been able to negotiate an alternative assignment, thereby preserving academic integrity without trampling on parental rights. We have lastly the weighing the choices. So, school leaders are not philosophers, but they can benefit from using standards that philosophers have employed for centuries. Kidder suggests three. So, first, we can examine the consequences of each choice and attempt to identify which lead to the most positive outcome. So this requires determining who will be affected and in what ways. Historically, this principle has been characterized as the greatest good for the greatest number. Second, we can invoke moral rules. So rules are based on the belief that the world would be better place if people always behave in a certain way. So for example, telling the truth. So rules ask us not to make exceptions to allow for individual circumstances, because every exceptions nibbles away at an important value. So the third is we can examine a dilemma for a perspective of caring. So Kidder sums up this principle with the golden rule. So how would we like to be treated under similar circumstances? He argues ethic is not a blind impartiality, doling out right and wrong according to some stone-cold canon of ancient and immutable law. It is a warm and supremely human activity that cares enough for others to want right to prevail. So caring is an appealing stance because of its apparent compassion, but it has important limitation. For one thing, decisions affect different people in different ways. Who should we care for the most? So there is also the practical reality that people would often like to be treated in ways that benefit can self-interest rather than the greatest good. So Kidder suggests that each of these perspectives throws a different light on a dilemma, highlighting certain features and obscuring others. Using all three as filters will provide as much firmer foundation for making an informed decision. So that's all for my report. Thank you.
Okay, class, let's proceed to the virtuous leader. Students of ethics are an anonymous one on one point. Moral leadership begins with moral leaders. In that respect, morality is unlike technical expertise. There are 8 classic virtues of moral leader. First is honesty. Honesty may be the fundamental virtue Unsocket observes it would be impossible to carry on a meaningful social life without being able to assume that most people are telling the truth most of the time. This is why Causes and Palmer 1995 have found that subordinates consistently list honestly as the most desirable leadership trait. In both personal and professional life, temptation to be dishonest are legion. To avoid confrontations, sought feelings, or simply get through the day with sanity intact. It seems so easy to lie, shades the truth, omit crucial information, or just let people believe what one knows to be untrue. Lying, in fact, may be the least common offense if I only because it is so easy to get caught. But anything that keeps from us saying what needs saying is deceitful. So this saying is failing to challenge others who are spreading misinformation, and also ignoring a different situation and the hope that it will go away on its own. And one is employing I euphemisms that whitewash an ugly reality with soothing words. Let's proceed to the loyalty. Loyalty. Whenever we commit ourselves to work with others in a common enterprise, we are called upon to maintain that commitment over time, even in the face of obstacles, disappointments, and distractions. Placing our loyalty somewhere is an important act of identity. Says Erach Shalef, we can place it in ourselves, and often this is important to help us stay a difficult course. But if we can place no loyalty outside ourselves, we became a kind of brigand, justifying any action regardless of its cost to others. So let's proceed to courage. Courage. It is difficult to see that school leadership requires courage. In the course of typical year, a principal may have to first is public, public, publicly take the blame for someone else's mistake, mis- make a decision for the greater good that is hurtful to an individual, approve a highly visible innovation that has no guaranteed success, and also disappoint esteemed friends and allies by compromising on an emotional issue. Trust subordinates to make a good decisions on sensitive issues. And the last one, tackle a messy complicated issue that might be ignored for a while longer. Donald Thomas defines courage as congruence between one's action and one's principles, adding that it is the ability to practice what one preaches. To stand on principle in the need arises and to accept the consequences of one's actions without excuse or attempt to circumvent them. So Chalice notes that courage requires an unnatural act, embracing risk rather than reducing it or running from it. However, the fear itself may generate the emotional energy to rise of it, especially if we can see clearly that what inspires us to take the risk course. For some, the source of courage is religion's values or personal philosophy, Some draw inspiration from personal heroes, some are deeply conscious of their commitment to others, and some act in responses to previous experience that have unaffected them deeply. So let's move up respect to respect. Strike and collegius equate the principle of equal respect with the golden rule, saying it requires that we regard human beings as having instinctively worth and treat them accordingly. This means that we cannot treat them as objects or as means to advance our own ends, and that we must respect their freedom of choice. So respect must shown concretely by soliciting feedback, being accessible, promoting constructive debate, and listening carefully. Causes and Posner in 1993 experience in settings suggests that similar behaviors are crucial in empowering teachers to accept the risk of significant change. All this requires time, according to Blaise and colleges, which may be the biggest barrier to showing respect. But another danger is professional arrogance because of their special expertise. Educators may be too quick to discount the views of lay people. One newspaper columnist who complained about educational funds reported numerous responses from educators asking the same indignant questions, like, who are you? What is your expertise? What is your advanced college degree in and where did you get it? According to Maggie Gallagher, respect is also easy to forget when working with children. Educators find it all too easy to treat students as objects or as tactical problems to be solved. But, immature or not, children have a deep sense of dignity. Of one sixth grader confined, kids really like to learn. We just don't like being pushed around. So let's proceed to caring. In the classical literature, love is frequently mentioned by contemporary educators with a sense of urgency. Without caring, writes writes Johann Lipsitz, individual human beings cannot thrive. Communities become violent battlegrounds. The Democratic experiment must ultimately fail, and the planet will not be able to support life. And Neil Noddings said emphasized that caring is not just an abstract concern for the welfare of children. It is highly personal commitment to a particular individuals at a particular time. When I care, I really hear, see or feel what the other tries to convey. When we watch a small child trying to tie her shoes, we often feel our fingers moving a sympathetic reactions. This is motivational displacement, the sense that our motive energy is flowing toward the others and their projects. I receive what the other conveys, and I want to respond in a way that furthers to others' purpose or project. This kind of caring requires a full attention to the other person. The caregiver must empty the soul of its own contents, momentarily putting aside his or her own preoccupations. For that reason, it can be difficult to achieve, especially when one is expected to care for many people. Sackett notes that caring has its limits, easily mutating into overprotectiveness or sentimentally and causing us to lose our professional objectivity. He also suggests that it isn't always appropriate to accept the other's goals. Sometimes we cannot care best by neglecting what they most want. And let's proceed to justice. Justice asks fundamental moral question. What do we owe to whom? In a world with scarce resources, how do we allocate goods in an equitable way? In a world where very life is unique, how do we determine what is fair? Philosophers have debated such questions for millennia. Thomas Sir Giovanni, drawing on a variety of philosophically traditions, offer three standards. So first is he suggests using Kant's categorical imperative of always treating the others as ends first and never just as means to an end. When we need to enlist people to our cause, they should be persuaded, not manipulated. Second is he discussed the John Rawls veil of ignorance, which asks that we make decisions of it as if we didn't know our personal interest in the case. For example, in handling a parental complaint about the teacher, we shouldn't act as though we were somehow prevented from knowing whether we were the parent, the teacher, or the students. Under those conditions, we could have much more incentive to be fair-minded and consider the interest of everyone. Finally, Sir Giovanni mentions Herbermann's moment of empathy, which asks us simply to place ourselves in the other person's shoes. These three principles imply that one trait of to justice is self-interest. When the decider will be affected by the outcome, there is always a reason to raise a questions of fairness. In the case of the principal who punished a possible innocent student, the discomfort came from a feeling that his own need to maintain a good faculty relations might be overwhelming his fairness. In general, school leaders will always be vulnerable to this temptation because almost everything that happens in a school affects their interests. And let's proceed to grace. Unlike the other virtues, on this list, grace is not instantly familiar, perhaps because it is much less common than it used to be. According to Rachel and Susan Tangley, define the term and include elements of elegance, dignity, stature, bearing, and ease of movement. As they describe it, it is involved forbearance, not giving it on displays of temper and pettiness. That might be fully justified. They give the example of superintendent who has arbitrarily non-renewed but refrained from arguing with the board of complaining the press. Instead, She served out her term and unflagging dedication. And the last one is living a virtuous life. Where do these virtues come from? How could they mature? Although some of preparation programs are now adding courses in ethics. So Robert Starrett says that leaders' moral force comes from something much deeper. It will be found in the narrative that persons' lives, in the influences of parents, role models, and heroes, in the lesson learned from multitude of positive as well as painful experiences. From reflection on the commentaries in historians, poets, and novelists, such as force comes from a life of trying to make sense out of experience, of asking how life should be lived, of exploring utopias and infernos. In short, the moral force of leadership comes from a life search for meaning and purpose in human existence. So communities of virtues vary in size, makeup, and location, and people may belong to more than one. Families are one type of moral community, churches and another. Sometimes people in certain geographic areas share common standards. Sometimes professional colleges do the same. The key, according to McIntyre, is that there be a sense commitment to the community and and to its standards. Finally, we can add some 2000-year-old advice from Aristotle. Virtue is a habit. Just as musicians develop musical ability by playing an instrument, people become virtuous by practicing virtue. As Chalep notes, our courage muscles will develop to the degree we exercise it. If we exercise if we exercise it when the risks are small, it will be strong enough to meet the challenge when the risks are large. So we are in this school leadership as calling. The concept of vocation in the older religious sense of calling. A vocation, says Dwayne Howard, is living life intentionally and often not written. While basic human virtues provide an essential foundation, every profession every profession faces unique challenges that call for special character traits. These special qualities are sometimes reflected in the concept of vocation. In the older religious sense of calling, a vocation, says Dwayne Habwer, Hubner, is living life intentionally and openly, not routinely. But if school leadership is a calling, exactly what were leaders called to be? The question is not often discussed in the form, but the literature provides a few clues to the special obligations of leadership. It's easy to overlook the moral dimensions of everyday leadership. So much of it seems to involve mundane, straightforward tech- technical tasks such as budgeting, scheduling, and monitoring boss duty. Yet, as Thomas Green has pointed out, budgeting is the principal means of making values concrete. A district that calls boldly of visions and empowerment and schools for the 21st century, but then slashes its in service but budget, sends a message that teachers have no trouble disappearing. Thus, leadership leaders must maintain a dual perspective, focusing not only on their day-to-day interactions with others, but one of ethical impact of the school's policies, practices, and structures. Starrett suggests that individual ethical experience excellence in futile in an institution that fails to serve moral purposes. Simply to assume that schools embody desirable standards is ethically naive if it not capable if not culpable. So the ethical school. Green observes educational leaders may have moral problems in their practice, not because they are unethical or because they lack a sense of honor, but because they lack of understanding, a clear vision of what their practice is centrally about, namely what it means to educate. Sir Giovanni agrees, saying that moral leadership revolves around a covenant. Sir Giovanni agrees, saying that moral leadership revolves around a covenant, a shared sense of purpose that forms basis for all actions and decisions in schools. In schools with covenants, educators share beliefs about what students need, how students learn, and how schools work. Furthermore, they hold another accountable those shared standards. These are difficult questions both in the sense that answers are not immediately obvious in the sense that many people afraid of what answers will be. It takes strong leaderships, puncture and comfortable illusions and invasions that sometimes sustain us. Like, do we treat all students equitably, or are hidden biases in the way we operate? And also, what does it mean to be well educated? What kind of human beings are we growing? Is that we want? Next is power and restraint. Power may be fundamental ethical issue for leaders. Every one of the leaders' daily unglamorous task moral weight simply but because it carries power with it the power to affect the lives of others. For students and teachers, the school is a place where they spend almost half of their waking hours, a place that can be source of productive and deep satisfactions, or in Arthur Wilde's phrase, a place that makes them crazy. The necessary regulations of school life, if it live with a recognition of their effects on people, can quickly become oppressive. Let's move up in applying ethical principles. Discussions about ethics stands and gravitate toward ideals and abstractions. Busy administrators may excuse for wondering how these concepts would actually work in the rather messy realm of everyday practice. For that for that reasons, this chapter ends in extended example of hypothetical case involving a principal who must deal with a poorly performance of the teacher. Paula Kellner faces difficult decision. Over the last 2 years, 2 years, she has received a growing number of complaints about Ed Halley, a veteran English teacher. The complaints are always the same: poor disciplines, uninspired lessons, and a failure challenge students. Although Kellner is only in her third year principal, she knows that Halley was once considered a competent, dedicated teacher. Indeed, his dedication has never been in doubt. He often arrives at school early, is seldom absent, and has often been moderating voice among more militant teachers. Applying the principles. Using the ideas presented earlier in the chapter, how could Kellner start to resolve her dilemma? First is deciding to deciding what important. This is the type of dilemma that Kyder describes as justice versus mercy. The conflicting the conflicting demands on the principal are clear. Justice demands that students get the good education are entitled to, and that a teacher who cannot deliver on his obligations should be dismissed. Yet Mercy urges us to recognize the impact of decision on a man who has given long and loyal service to several generations of students. Second is reflection. As she mulls over the dilemma, Kellner's first instinct is to search for alternatives. One alternative, one attractive alternative may enact to be demanded by the contract. Working with a teacher to improve his performance, although the problem appears to involve more than lack of know how exploring his option seems preferable to arbitrarily closing the door on decades of experience. Another possibility is Luke Halley's work assignment. Sometimes working with a different ages group will lessen the problem. Indeed, a new assignment sometimes shakes up comfortable routines enough that something of a renaissance occurs. Conceivable, there may be non-classroom positions that the teacher could fill. So practical alternatives are not always within reach, of course, and Kellner may be stuck with an either or choice. Her Kidder's ethical filters may be helpful. First is the consequence. If the principal decides in a favor non-renewal, the most obvious consequence to Halley, who not loses his job but sees 3 decades of service come to a bitter end. If Kellner decides not to take action, students will pay a price in lost learning opportunities and negative attitudes that may carry over the other classes. The decision may also have an impact on other teachers. Non-renewals can threaten morally and increase tension throughout the staff, especially when a veteran teacher is involved. Aside from the obvious political fallout, productivity throughout the schools may be affected. At the same time, the decision will send an important signal about standards and expectations. Second is moral rules. Kellner seems to be grappling with two implicit rules. First, first is do not knowingly expose students to inadequate teaching. Schools exist to educate students. Accepting poor teaching undermines that missions. Second is do not cause pain for others. This is no way to pretend that Holly would not be deeply hurt financially and psychologically by a non-renewal. These rules are clearly in conflict with no obvious way to reconcile them. Kellner must decide which one has priority. And the last one is caring. As someone whose whole career has been in education, Kellner can readily put herself in Holly's place. Too young to live, too old to start over. If she is honest, she will admit that she would not want to be cut loose by an institution to which she had devoted her life, e- even if her performance was not all that it had been once. On the other hand, Kellner must also care for the students whose education is suffering from Holly's poor teaching, where she has students' authority to provide a worthy teacher. In the end, the decision may rest less on logic than on the kind of person she is, and on the strength of the virtues she possesses. Lacking courage, she would almost certainly take the less controversial course of retaining. Highly possessing grace, she would be more confident about managing the painful process of non-renewal, living a life of honest, she would be less likely to pretend the problem doesn't exist. In this way, living virtuously in the foundation for ethical decisions. That's all, and thank you, classmate.